I'm going to talk to you a bit about Xamarin today. Now, before we get started, can I just get a show of hands? Who has used Xamarin in one of their apps? Oh, good. Good. There's a good number of you who have. So for those of you who haven't, I'm going to do a brief explanation of what Xamarin is, and then we'll talk about some of the things that are coming down the line that's new. So those of you who've used Xamarin before, just will get to see something new. It worked. So Xamarin apps are cross-platform apps that you can write for UWP, iOS, and Android. And they look and feel native, even though they're written in C#. And that's because they are native. You can reuse your existing teams, your existing skills, and your existing code to write apps that target any platform. And that's pretty amazing. Xamarin apps render with native UI. So they look and feel like they belong on the platform. They also use native APIs on the devices, which means they can also take advantage of native performance. In short, they're a pretty great way of building cross-platform apps. Now, anything you can do in Objective-C, Swift, or Java can also be done in C# with Xamarin. That's because we natively bind to the native APIs using something similar to pinvoke, if you've ever used that before. And this is way better than using wrappers, as it allows the Xamarin team to be super responsive when they're updating the UIs, so when they're updating their libraries. So every time there's a new OS release from Android or iOS, the Xamarin team pride themselves on turning around and update to Xamarin within a couple of days. So you always have access to the latest things. They also make sure that the bindings they provide have been optimized for C# and .NET to help with your productivity. With Android, we obviously support Java binding projects. With iOS, we support Objective-C binding projects, and also newly CocoaPods. We have an importer for that as well. And coming soon, we'll have the Swift Netifier, which will allow you to consume Swift APIs into .NET. And I'm very excited about that in particular. We're also adding way more automation support as well. So there are a couple of different ways you can actually reach these different platforms with Xamarin. And we're going to talk through a few of those different ones today. The first one, and probably the most common one you'll think about, is where you have a shared bunch of C# logic, which has all of your business logic that powers your app. It's one code base you write once. But you can actually have individual native heads that sit on top of that. So you can still build your native iOS or your native Android or native UWP on top. So let's take a little look at a demo of how this is done. So I'm going to be making my demos on the Android emulator. I can obviously do the same thing with iOS, as you saw in the keynote, or with UWP. But I thought it would be nice to show something different, so we'll see Android for this. Now, for those of you who've built with Xamarin before, you may have tried the kind of typical Hello World app, which for Xamarin is an app called Tasky, which is a very, very simple to-do list. So here I can launch Tasky in my emulator. Notice how this looks and feels like an Android app. I can add a task to this. I get the Android input boxes, and I can say something like, I don't know, I'm going to say, let's buy some more beer. I think I've already got beer on my list, but we'll buy some more, because you can never have enough. So I'm buying some beer. Very simple app, very native looking. Let's have a look at this in Visual Studio. So I'm going to open up my Tasky app here, go to my Solution Explorer. And you'll see here I have one solution with 3 different heads. I've got a head for my Android app and a head for my iOS app. And then I've got this portable library here. If I expand my Android app, you'll see I've got the structure you'd expect to see from an Android project. I expand resources and layouts, and I have all of my Android-style pages. And if I actually look at the home screen over here, you can see that it is using Android controls and Android syntax. This is all written in AXML. We have the same thing for iOS. But what's clever about this is the code that powers these is actually C#. So if I look at my Android code behind here, you can see that the home screen is actually inheriting from an activity. For my iOS head, it's inheriting from a dialog view controller. But it's all still C#, so it's reusing the skills you guys already have. I also have some shared code, and I have this in my portable library down here. And I've got a to-do database C# file here. And this basically acts as a wrapper for all the C# operations. So here you can see I'm building the wrapper for my SQLite connection, and it's dealing with saving the items to the to-do list and retrieving them from it. A super simple way to share your C# code across your projects. So that was the first approach we've got. Shared business logic, shared code, individual UI heads. But wouldn't it be great if you could actually share more than just the code and actually share all of your UI as well across these different endpoints? Well, you can. Xamarin has something called Xamarin Forms. It allows you to build native UIs, but you code them once in XAML, and then they will still render in a native way on each of those platforms. As you can see in the little screenshot we've got here, we have an iPhone here, and the UI looks like an iPhone. On the Android, it looks like Android, and on the Windows Phone, it looks like a Windows Phone app. This is a super powerful way of sharing the code base and your UI code across both platforms, aiming for about 90% reuse. So in a diagram form, because I love diagrams, you can see we now have two different ways of doing it. You'll see I've slightly shaded out the little rectangles underneath the shared forms. The reason I've done that is just to really emphasize that these actually get rendered down as native controls. So let's take a look at how that works. So back in my Android emulator, I'm going to show you a different app now. It's a very, very simple app that I've got. It's a file uploader. And what it will do is it will take an image, in this case, the Xamarin Monkey, which is the mascot for Xamarin, which means you get really fun swag when you go to Xamarin events. And we're going to take this monkey, and we're going to upload it to Azure, just to Azure storage. And provided you're not all holding the internet, it will go up. There we go. And I can bring it all down. There we go. Very, very simple app. Pushing it up and bringing it down from the server. But you'll see that this UI is native Android. It uses their fonts, it uses their controls, it uses their buttons. Let's have a look in Visual Studio and see how this one was built. So here I have my file uploader solution. This time I have heads for Android, for iOS, and UWP. And I have this new one, this shared UI and logic project, which you can see is denoted by these conjoined diamonds over here. Inside my Android project, I have the same things you'd expect to see in a project when it comes to just setting it up. But in the shared project now, I have this XAML folder. And in the XAML folder, I have native standard UWP XAML, I guess, XAML standard XAML now. And this will actually get rendered down onto iOS, Android, and UWP using their native controls. I, of course, also keep my shared logic in here now as well. In my Azure storage file, this is where I'm wrapping my pushing of the image up and bringing it down from Azure storage. So I've got very little now actually in these individual head projects. Majority of it now is completely shared UI and shared logic across all three different platforms. OK. So I'm going to switch tracks a little bit now and talk about what we announced at Build 2017, for those of you who've used Xamarin in the past. First of all, we're making much more investments into Xamarin Forms. So as well as iOS, Android, and UWP, we're now pleased to announce support for macOS, WPF, Linux, and Samsung have recently built Tizen support for Xamarin Forms. This is super powerful. That means you now have 7 different platforms you can target with Xamarin, all with one code base. That's pretty amazing. We want to make sure you guys are as powerful as possible on as many devices as you can target. We're also investing more in Xamarin Forms from a UX perspective. We're making it take up less memory. We're focusing on performance as well. And we're also starting to support theming so that we will respect the user's choice of theming as they go between devices. We're also introducing a new concept called Forms Embedding. And I think this is super powerful, particularly for those of you who've either built Xamarin Forms apps in the past, or those of you who want to move to Xamarin and Xamarin Forms that haven't quite got there yet. This is a great way of embedding Xamarin Forms within an app that has a native head to it. So in this example on the screen here, I'm just showing an Android to be consistent with my other apps. But I can actually have native Android pages linked to Xamarin Forms pages and vice versa. This is great if you want to gradually move to Xamarin Forms. It means you can start to gradually introduce new pages that are in this shared Forms code base. On the flip side, if there's a control that you really want to use in your Xamarin Forms project that isn't available yet in Xamarin Forms, you can actually bring a native page in from that platform. So you get the best of both worlds here. So now we have 3 different ways that we can make our apps work across multiple platforms. We have shared C# logic and individual native heads. We have shared logic and shared forms. And now we have a hybrid model, We want to make sure it's easy for you to move to Xamarin and Xamarin Forms and reuse all of your existing XAML knowledge and your C# knowledge. So let's take a look at how this works. Here I am back in my emulator. I'm going to quit this app. And I have a very simple weather app here. Again, when I launch it, this looks like an Android app. And what I can do is search for a city. So I'm going to type in Warsaw and get the weather forecast for Warsaw. There we go. It's in Fahrenheit. I wanted it in Celsius, but I'm afraid it's in Fahrenheit. We'll have to figure that translation out. This page here is a native Android page that we've coded. So this is written in AXML. We've added a new page called Your Places, and this brings together all of the cities that I've searched for in the past. So when I tap on Your Places, it brings up this page that's actually written in Xamarin Forms. So this is a seamless transition between a native Android page and a Xamarin Forms page, all within the same app. And you notice it's still using all of Android's fonts, its headers, all the kind of things you'd expect to see on the device. So the user can see no difference between this. Let's have a look at how this app is constructed. So here I am inside my weather app solution. And I've got native heads for Android, iOS, and UWP, as you'd expect to see, since we have some native code there. I also have some shared code in my forms. And if I expand my Android project and go into one of the pages I've got in my layouts, such as this main fragment page here, you'll see that this is all native Android code, just like you'd expect to see. Our history page, however, is a shared piece of code. So I'm going to go into my weather.forms and open up my history page, which I happen to have open here. And you'll see that this is using XAML for that shared page. So we're mixing these two things very easily between the two. And navigation between a native page and a Xamarin Forms page is super simple as well. If I go into my main activity page, which is where I actually call my history page, you can see when I actually start to initiate the page, I call a method called createFragment. And this wraps our Xamarin Forms page in a way that can be used in the project. Super simple way of mixing the two forms together to help you either migrate to the platform or bring in features that haven't been implemented just yet in the native one. Cool. As I mentioned in the keynote, we got a lot of feedback from you guys around Xamarin Forms, and making them more consistent is a big deal for us to make it easier for you. We'll be merging these into XAML Standard, and just to reiterate it again, please go to the GitHub. Please give us your feedback. We're currently specifying what we want to build, so you can actually come in right at the earliest stage and influence the direction that we take to make sure we build stuff that is useful for you guys. Last year, we announced a whole suite of tools to help you manage your projects through distribution, through testing, a bunch of things like that. The trouble is that we had a bunch of different logins. They're all disparate tools. They weren't very well connected together, mainly because a lot of these were through companies we'd acquired. Well, last year at Build, we actually joined all of these together into the Visual Studio Mobile Center, which is your single one-stop shop to do anything with app distribution and testing. You can build, you can test, you can get your crash reports, you can flight, all the kind of stuff you'd expect to do with your apps. And this year, we're building on top of it by adding some new features. We now support the Xcode UI test toolkit, along with Espresso for Android projects. When we launched, initially, we supported GitHub. We've also added support for Bitbucket and Visual Studio Team Foundation Server. And UWP was missing from a lot of those offerings, so we've worked hard to make sure that UWP support is available as well. UWP support is coming in 2 phases. The first phase is already launched, and that gave you build and test. And we'll be adding support for analytics later on this year. So it's a very, very quick overview about what is possible to do with Xamarin and Xamarin Forms. We have some fantastic labs in the workshops tomorrow if you actually get hands-on with this stuff. And we have experts who'll be circulating the room to help you. I really hope you enjoy the rest of the Build tour, and also that you enjoy your lunch.